Okay, in this problem we have an equation to solve. It's a polynomial equation. Now, in this example, I want to look not at solving by the quadratic formula, which you could definitely do if that was an option. But one of the problems that people typically have difficulty with on the exam is problems involving completing the square. It's probably the one topic that almost everybody, or a good percentage of people, do end up missing. So I want to go over this. This is definitely a more complicated completing the square one. Definitely one of the more difficult ones because we will end up having to work with fractions. But remember the process for completing the square. We want to first get the variables by themselves. So that means we're going to take whatever we have that doesn't have a variable, and we want that on the other side of the equation. And so we go ahead and we move that 8 over to the other side. Now, to complete the square, the process that we use requires, for completing the square requires that the x squared term doesn't have anything in front of it, cannot have a coefficient. So we have to divide everything by 5 so that becomes just an x squared. So doing that gives us the equation now, x squared plus 5x equals 8/5. And now we're ready to go through the process of completing the square. So we had this little initial stuff we had to do first. And now we're ready to go through the process of completing the square. So remember what we need to do is we need to take half to figure out how to complete the square. We begin always by taking half of that number, half of 5x, and half of the 5 and then squaring it. So half of the 5 is 5/2, and then we square it. And that's what we're going to need to add to x squared plus 5x to turn this into a perfect square. We're going to have to add 25/4. And that 25/4 will also have to be added to the other side. So what makes this a little harder, is that we have to deal with adding some fractions. And so we go ahead and we do that. We add the 25/4 onto both sides. Now on the left-hand side, this is just going to factor now as x plus 5/2. So I'm going to go ahead and we could go ahead and write that down. And we will in a moment here, but first I want to go ahead and say, hey, look, to add these, I need to get a common denominator, 8/5 and 25/4. So for 5 and 4, the common denominator would be 20. That would turn that into 32/20. That's right, because we'd have to multiply both top and bottom by 4. And then the other one, we'd have to multiply both top and bottom by 5. So we have 32 over 20. Plus 125 over 20. Okay, and so now simplifying, on the left-hand side, I just go ahead and factor x plus 5/2 quantity squared equals, and now we can just add. And that'll actually become 157 over 20. 157 over 20. Okay. And at this point now, we've done the completing the square process. What remains now is to solve this equation. So we solve this equation by using our square root property. So we apply square root to both sides. Now as I'm doing that here, this will just become x plus 5/2. Because of the square root, making that absolute value, we'll bring the plus or minus over. Here I have a radical that I have to deal with. 157 over 20. Now, I'm going to go ahead and multiply both top and bottom by 20 here to rationalize this. So the denominator is a nice whole number. It'll be 20 times 20, which is 400. And the square root of that would just be 20. Okay. So we have to do that as a means to simplify. That's what makes this one a little more complicated as well. So when we do that, Multiplying on the top there, we'll have 20 times 157 will make that 3140. We'll make that 3140. So it's square root of 3140 over 20. And then we simplify. We can actually, with this 3140 here, we can actually simplify that, right, by pulling out. As we simplify there, the square root of 3140, actually had a typo in my work, so I had to pause the video for a moment to fix that. 3140, we can actually take a 4 out of that. So we'll actually have a square root of 4, which would be 2. And so when we do that, 4 goes into 3140 785 times. And then the square root of 4, which is 2, would cancel with the 20 to make it a 10. I actually had a 5 there by mistake. That was a typo on my part. Okay, and so then we have all that stuff over 10. And now the final step is to get x by itself. So we just need to take that 5/2, slip it over to the other side, and then finally we have our answer here. X equals negative 5/2 plus or minus square root of 785 over 10. And so we have our two solutions there, the plus square root and the minus the square root of 785 over 10. Okay, and so that's the process of completing the square. This example is a little bit harder than some of the ones you'll probably run into, but at least gives you, the overall steps. And sometimes it's I think it's worth being able to see a harder example, and that'll make some of the easier ones not seem quite so daunting.